The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as familiar to the men of Black Hawk County as the drone of a John Deere two-cylinder on a heavy pull. It was late March 1972. The frost was just coming out of the ground, leaving the gravel lot a muddy soup that sucked at a man's boots. The air smelled of wet earth, cheap coffee, and the faint, sad odor of failure. Another farm sale. This one belonged to the Miller family, who'd tried to get big too fast. Jedediah Stone stood at the edge of the crowd, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn canvas jacket. He wasn't here to buy land or big-ticket items. He was a scavenger, a connoisseur of the overlooked and the undervalued. He was watching for a specific gear set for his old Gleaner E combine, maybe a decent set of 18.438 tires if they went cheap enough. He ran a clean, tight operation on the 240 acres his father had left him, and the first rule of the Stone farm was the same as it had been for 3 generations. You don't buy what you can't pay for in cash. The crowd parted as Richard Vance swaggered through, a cigarillo clamped in his teeth and a checkbook peeking from his breast pocket. Vance was the new breed of farmer. He didn't own much land, but he leased over 1,000 acres. He ran a brand new fleet of international harvester machines, all red and shiny, all financed to the hilt by the Merchants Bank downtown. He clapped a man on the back, laughed a booming laugh that seemed to echo his own self-importance, and made a beeline for the main line of equipment. "Morning, Jed," Vance said, his voice dripping with a kind of patronizing friendliness. "Come to pick at the bones?" Jed just nodded, his gaze steady. "Morning, Rick, just looking." "Yeah, well, there's not much here for a real operator," Vance said, waving a dismissive hand at the miller's well-used but solid line of Oliver tractors. "I'm just here to pick up that 715 combine. Got a deal worked out with the bank already. A man's got to keep his fleet modern if he wants to stay in the game." He winked, as if sharing a secret of success that Jed was too simple to understand. Jed didn't reply. He just watched as Vance spent the next hour buying with the casual arrogance of a man playing with house money. The combine, the big 1855 Oliver tractor, the disc, the planter. He paid top dollar, driving the price up for the few local guys trying to get a deal, then signing the bank's slip with a flourish. Then they dragged out the last item from behind the barn. It was a monster, a ghost from another era. An early model Steiger, one of the first articulated four-wheel drives to ever roam these flatlands. It was a Wildcat, from back when the Steiger brothers were still welding them together themselves in their barn up in Minnesota. The beast was in a sorry state. The massive 8-cylinder Caterpillar diesel was half disassembled, its guts open to the Iowa humidity. One of the planetary hubs was leaking a slow black blood into the mud. The tires, big enough for a man to stand in, were cracked and bald. A thick coat of rust bloomed through the faded chalky green paint. The auctioneer, a man named Henderson, cleared his throat. "All right, boys, what we have here is, well, it's a project, a real man-sized project. Model 1700 Steiger, Cat 3160 V8 diesel, needs a full rebuild. We're selling it as is, where is. For parts or for scrap? What am I bid? Let's start it at scrap price, $500. Do I hear 500? Silence. The farmers shuffled their feet. A few chuckled. Vance let out a loud snort. "You'd have to pay a man $500 just to haul that thing away, Henderson." The auctioneer ignored him. $500, who'll give me $5? $400. Give me $300, boys. The frame and the axles are worth that. Jed stepped forward slightly. He'd been looking at the machine not for what it was, but for what it was built from. The frame was quarter-inch welded steel plate. The axles were Clark Planetaries, the same kind they used in heavy earth-moving equipment. The transmission was a Spicer 10-speed. It was crude, it was ugly, but it was built like a battleship. He'd heard stories about these early Steigers. They were simple, brutally strong, and if you had the patience, you could fix them with a wrench and a torch. $300, Jed said, his voice quiet but clear. Every head turned. Vance looked at him as if he'd just started speaking in tongues. A low murmur went through the crowd. Henderson's eyes lit up. "I got $300 from Jed Stone. Who'll give $350? $350. Vance laughed again, louder this time. "Let him have it. He can park it next to that old farmel of his. Start a museum of junk. Sold. Henderson slapped his hand for $300 to Jedediah Stone. As the crowd began to disperse, Vance walked over to Jed, shaking his head with a smirk. Jed, I swear I don't understand you. What in God's name are you going to do with that relic? The parts alone will cost you more than a down payment on a new 1466. The bank is practically giving money away right now. Jed looked from Vance's polished boots to the hulking green wreck. It'll run, he said, the words tasting of iron and oil in his mouth. Run, Vance scoffed. That thing will run you straight into the poorhouse. You and your daddy, always afraid to take a chance, always pinching pennies while the world passes you by. You can't farm in the 70s with equipment from the 40s. Jed's jaw tightened at the mention of his father, but he kept his voice even. My equipment is paid for, Rick. Every last bolt. Paid for and worthless, Vance shot back, turning to walk away. You call me when you want to learn how to really make money in this business. He flicked his cigarillo butt into a puddle and strode toward his shiny new pickup truck, the one with the dealer's name still stenciled on the tailgate. Jed stood alone in the muddy lot, the auctioneer's receipt in his hand. He looked at the dead machine, a mountain of iron and problems. Everyone saw a pile of scrap. Vance saw a joke. The banker saw a liability. But Jed saw something else. He saw a foundation. He saw independence. He saw a future free from the whims of men like Richard Vance and the friendly loan officers at Merchants Bank. He saw a way to fight, on his own terms. Before we get into the grease and the grit of what it took to bring that beast back to life, I gotta ask you all something. Have you ever taken on a project everyone said was a lost cause? A piece of machinery, a car, maybe even a piece of land that everyone else had written off? Let me know down in the comments, because Jed Stone was about to live that story for the next 10 years, and it all started right here, in the mud, with $300 worth of someone else's failure. Getting the Steiger home was the first battle. It took a neighbor with a lowboy trailer and a winch that groaned like a dying animal. They dragged it into Jed's machine shed, a long tin-roofed building that smelled of damp concrete and old iron. The tractor was so big it barely cleared the doorframe, and it filled the main bay, dwarfing his trusty John Deere 4020. That 4020 was his pride and joy. He'd bought it used 5 years ago and had rebuilt the diesel engine himself, machining the head in the high school ag shop over one long winter. It ran like a top, never failed him, but it was only 100 horsepower. It was a good tractor, but it wasn't big enough for the deep ripping he knew his compacted soils needed. For the next week, Jed just circled the Steiger like a wolf sizing up a moose. He carried a notepad and a flashlight, peering into the dark, greasy recesses of the machine. He made lists, long lists, engine, transmission, hydraulics, electrical, tires. The sheer scale of the task was enough to make a lesser man call the scrapyard and take the $100 profit. He started with the engine, that legendary Caterpillar 3160 V8. It was a high-speed, relatively lightweight diesel for its time, known more for powering gravel trucks than tractors. The previous owner, in a fit of misguided ambition, had tried to overhaul it himself and had given up, leaving the heads off and the cylinder liners exposed. A fine layer of rust had bloomed on the cylinder walls. Mouse nests, packed with corn silks and insulation, were crammed into every conceivable opening. The first step was a deep clean. He spent 2 days with a pressure washer, a scraper, and 5 gallons of degreaser, blasting away decades of caked-on grime and mud. The water that ran across the concrete floor of his shop was a thick black sludge. Underneath it all, the steel was solid. No cracks in the frame, no welds broken. The bones were good. Then came the teardown. He borrowed an engine hoist from the co-op and, with a series of chains and groaning pulleys, lifted the V8 block out of the frame. It swung in the air like a side of beef, a solid ton of cast iron. He mounted it on an engine stand he'd built himself out of old railroad iron, a stand that groaned under the weight. Working every night after his chores were done, fueled by his wife Sarah's strong black coffee, he disassembled the engine piece by piece. The work was brutal. Bolts 1.5 inches across refused to budge, forcing him to use a 3-foot breaker bar with a pipe on the end for extra leverage, his muscles screaming in protest. He laid each part out on a wooden bench in the exact order it came off, a habit his father had drilled into him. Pistons, connecting rods, bearings, camshaft. Each piece told a story of wear and neglect. The crankshaft journals were scored. 2 of the cylinder liners had hairline cracks. The turbocharger was seized solid. The parts list grew longer. He spent his evenings on the party line telephone, calling salvage yards in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and South Dakota. He spoke a language of part numbers and casting codes, a dialect understood only by other mechanics and grizzled yard owners. "Yeah, I'm looking for a set of standard-size main bearings for a Cat 3160. You got a crankshaft out of a '69 Ford C-Series truck. Should be the same. Need a turbo, part number 7N4651? No, the housing has to be intact." Parts would arrive in greasy cardboard boxes, delivered by the mailman who'd shake his head as he dropped another heavy package on the porch. Jed would mic them with his calipers, checking tolerances down to the 1,000th of an inch. If it wasn't perfect, he sent it back. The gossip at the co-op was relentless. Jed became the local punchline. "Heard Jed Stone's building a tractor from a catalogue," one farmer would say over coffee. "Yeah, the Sears and Roebuck catalogue," another would cackle. Vance, of course, was the ringleader. "I drove by his place last night," he'd announced to the whole table. "Lights on in the shed at midnight." He was in there staring at that pile of junk like he was trying to bring it to life with his mind. Poor Sarah. Married to the only man in the county, trying to farm his way back into the 19th century. Jed heard the talk. It came back to him through his neighbors, through the parts man at the implement dealer. It stung, mostly because of the jab about his father. His dad had been a cautious man, a survivor of the Great Depression who trusted land and hard work, not bankers and paper promises. He died with the farm paid for and money in the bank, a feat Vance's generation saw as a lack of vision. To Jed, it was the definition of success. He was honoring his father's memory, and they were mocking him for it. He pushed the noise away and focused on the work. He honed the cylinder block himself with a borrowed tool. He carefully installed the new liners after freezing them in the deep freeze to make them shrink just enough to slide in. He plastigauged every bearing, torqued every bolt to spec, following the worn pages of a Caterpillar service manual he'd paid $50 for. His hands were a permanent mess of cuts, scrapes, and grease that wouldn't come out from under his fingernails, no matter how hard Sarah scrubbed at them. One night, late in the fall, Sarah came out to the shop with a thermos of coffee. She found him sitting on an upturned bucket, just staring at the fully assembled engine, now painted in fresh Caterpillar yellow. It was mounted back in the green frame. "It's beautiful, Jed," she said softly. He looked up, his face smudged with grease, his eyes tired but shining with a fierce pride. "It's right," he said. "Every bearing, every seal. It's right." "When will you try to start it?" she asked. "Tomorrow," he said, a nervous energy in his voice. "If she'll fire, the rest is just work. If she won't, then Vance is right." The next morning, the air was crisp with the promise of winter. Jed had hooked up temporary fuel lines and a battery he'd pulled from his 4020. He'd primed the fuel system, bled the injectors, and checked the oil for the 10th time. He climbed up onto the operator's platform, the cold steel shocking through his jeans. There was no cab, just a seat and a set of levers. He took a deep breath, the smell of new paint and diesel filling his lungs. He turned the key. The starter motor, a massive Delco Remy unit, engaged with a heavy clunk. It groaned, turning the big V8 over slowly, painfully. Chug, chug, chug. White smoke, unburnt fuel, puffed from the open exhaust manifold. Chug, chug, chug. He could feel the doubt creeping in, the jeering voices from the coffee shop echoing in his head. He held the key, praying, chug, chug, kaboom. A single cylinder fired, sending a black smoke ring puffing toward the shed's ceiling. Then another, chug, kaboom, chug, kaboom, chug. The rhythm quickened. The slow, labored cranking turned into a rough, shaking, violent roar as the engine caught on all 8 cylinders. The whole shed seemed to vibrate. The noise was deafening, a raw, mechanical thunder that was nothing like the refined purr of Vance's new machines. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated power. Jed pulled back the throttle, and the engine settled into a high, rumbling idle. A wide grin split his face. He'd done it. He had brought the monster back to life. The heart was beating. Now he just had to build the rest of the animal around it. It took another full year, a year of nights and weekends, a year of rebuilding the transmission, replacing every seal and bearing in the planetary hubs, and running hundreds of feet of new hydraulic lines and electrical wires. He fabricated a new dashboard from a sheet of steel and installed a set of simple, reliable Stewart-Warner gauges. For the finishing touch, he painted the whole machine himself. Not the original Steiger green, but a tough, industrial grey, the kind of paint they used on bridges and battleships. It wasn't pretty, it was functional. It looked like what it was, a machine built for one purpose, to pull. By the spring of 1974, it was ready. The talk at the co-op had died down, replaced by a grudging curiosity. The day Jed first drove it out of the shed, neighbors stopped their pickups on the road to watch. The machine, now shod with a new set of deep lug tires, looked immense, powerful, and utterly out of place among the small, tidy farms of the area. That spring, while Vance was pulling a 24-foot field cultivator with his brand-new air-conditioned IH-1466, Jed hooked the grey beast to an old heavy-duty 7-shank V-ripper he'd bought for a song at another auction. He dropped it in the ground, a full 18 inches deep, into soil that hadn't been broken that deep in a generation. He throttled up the Cat V8, and the tractor didn't even grunt. It just dug in its 4 massive tires and pulled, the black smoke rolling from its single, straight exhaust pipe as it tore through the compacted plough pan. He was doing in one pass what would have taken other farmers 3. The timing, it turned out, was perfect. The world was hungry. Grain prices, driven by massive sales to the Soviet Union, were shooting for the moon. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz was on the radio, his voice a clarion call to every farmer in the heartland. Get big or get out, plant fence row to fence row. Land prices doubled, then doubled again. It was a boom time, a golden era for American agriculture. And Richard Vance was the local golden boy. He used his soaring profits and the bank's easy credit to expand aggressively. He bought the 160 acres to the east of Jed, paying a price that made old-timers whistle. Then he bought another 320 on the other side of the county. His line of credit at Merchants Bank was a local legend. Every spring, a new piece of equipment would appear in his yard. A John Deere 4840, the biggest 2-wheel drive they made. A brand new 24-row planter. A Gleaner N7 combine with a hydrostatic transmission and a grain monitor in the cab. He built a new house, a sprawling ranch-style home with a 2-car garage set far back from the road. He was the embodiment of the new, prosperous American farmer. He'd sometimes stop his new pickup at the end of Jed's lane and watch the old grey Steiger working in the field. He'd shake his head, a look of pity on his face. Jed was making good money, same as everyone. The high yields from his deep-ripped ground and the soaring commodity prices saw to that. But he wasn't behaving like it. He was still driving his 10-year-old Ford pickup. He and Sarah still lived in the same modest, 100-year-old farmhouse his grandfather had built. The money Jed made went to 3 places. First, he paid off the small operating loan he'd taken out for the parts to rebuild the Steiger. Second, he replaced the roof on the barn and put a new coat of paint on the house. The rest, the vast majority of it, went into a savings account at the bank, earning a modest 5% interest. His banker, a man named Mr. Abernathy, would look at his savings passbook with a puzzled expression. "Jed, this is a fine nest egg," he'd say, peering over his bifocals. "But this money isn't working for you. With land values the way they are, you could leverage this, buy that quarter section next to you. Rick Vance just picked up another farm. The man understands that you have to use debt as a tool." "My father taught me debt is a cage, Mr. Abernathy," Jed would reply politely. "I'm happy with what I've got." Abernathy would sigh. "You're a good farmer, Jed, but you're thinking like your father. It's a different world now. Inflation is running at 10%. That money in your savings account is losing value every day you leave it sitting there." Jed would just nod and thank him for the advice. He heard the same thing everywhere. He was a relic, a failure in the midst of success. A man who brought a knife to a gunfight and somehow hadn't been shot yet. He was mocked for his caution, for his refusal to join the great land rush. While others were getting rich on paper, their net worth exploding with the value of their land, Jed was just methodically farming his 240 acres, maintaining his old, paid-for equipment and salting away cash. He was seen as a man paralyzed by fear, unable to seize the opportunity of a lifetime. One cool evening in the late summer of 1979, Jed was in his shop, changing the oil on the Steiger. He had the radio on, tuned to the station out of Des Moines. The farm report was over and the national news came on. He only half listened as he strained against the large canister oil filter, the smell of hot diesel filling the air. The announcer's voice was grave, talking about runaway inflation, the price of oil, and a crisis of confidence in the country. Then he mentioned a name Jed had never heard before, Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve. The announcer said this man was promising to break the back of inflation, no matter the cost. He spoke of monetary discipline and a tightening of the money supply. The phrases were abstract, Washington speak that felt a million miles away from his workshop in Black Hawk County. But then the report mentioned something Jed understood perfectly: interest rates. Volcker was going to raise them, sharply. Jed stopped turning the wrench. He wiped a greasy hand across his forehead and looked out the open door of the shop. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Across the section, he could see the yard lights of Rick Vance's new farmstead click on, illuminating a fleet of machinery that was worth more than Jed's entire farm. All of it new, all of it gleaming, and all of it, Jed knew, bought and paid for by the merchant's bank. A cold knot tightened in the pit of his stomach. He didn't understand economics or federal policy, but he understood debt. He understood what happened when the cost of borrowing money went up. He looked at his own machines, the grey Steiger, the old 4020, the Gleaner Combine, all sitting silent and secure under his roof. Not a single payment was due on any of them. For the first time in years, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, his father's old-fashioned ways weren't so foolish after all. The world was about to change, and Jed had a feeling that the storm was heading right for the heartland. The talk from the Des Moines radio station faded into the background, replaced by the familiar hum of the shop lights and the chirping of crickets in the tall grass outside. The summer of 1980 had been born in heat and had grown into a monster. Day after day, a merciless sun beat down from a hazy, white sky, baking the moisture from the topsoil. The corn, which had looked so promising in June, began to show the strain. Its deep green leaves started to curl inward during the heat of the day, a plant's desperate attempt to conserve what little water it held. They called it pineappling, and it was the first sign of a dying crop. Jed watched his fields with a growing unease, but his deep tillage with the Steiger had given his crops an advantage. The roots had gone down deep, finding the subsoil moisture that others, with their shallower plow pans, couldn't reach. His corn was stressed, but it was surviving. Richard Vance's corn was not. Spread across more than 1,500 acres, his operation was a marvel of modern efficiency, but it was a thirsty one. His fields, worked for years with heavy disc harrows, had a hardpan layer a foot down that the roots couldn't penetrate. He was watching millions of dollars in potential yield wither on the stalk. The pressure on him was immense. The banknotes on his new equipment and land were calculated on $3 corn and 150 bushel yields. He was looking at half that yield, if he was lucky. One sweltering afternoon, Jed was cultivating his soybeans when he saw Vance's massive John Deere 4840 sitting idle in the middle of a field, heat shimmering off its green hood. A service truck from the dealership was parked beside it. Jed finished his row and drove his 4020 over to the fence line. Vance was standing there, his arms crossed, his face a mask of frustration, as a young mechanic in a clean uniform fiddled with a wiring harness under the tractor's tilting cowl. "Trouble, Rick," Jed called out, shutting down his old John Deere. The sudden silence was filled with the buzz of cicadas. Vance kicked at a dirt clod. "Damn computer," he spat. The transmission control module went out. "Power shift is locked in park. Thing won't move an inch." He gestured at the sleek, futuristic cab. "Got an air conditioner, a radio, a buddy seat, and 1,000 wires to tell you what's wrong, but it can't tell you how to fix it. The kid here says the part has to come from the warehouse in Moline. They're on strike. Might be a week. Might be a month." Jed nodded slowly, looking at the paralyzed giant. It was a beautiful machine, but it was as useless as a rock. That's a tough break. A week, Jed, Vance said, his voice strained. I lose 5 bushels to the acre for every day I can't get my last pass of nitrogen on this corn. This thing, he slapped the huge rear tire, is costing me $10,000 a day just sitting here. Just then, a loud bang echoed from Jed's farm. A black plume of hydraulic fluid sprayed into the air from the side of the grey Steiger. Jed's son, young Tom, who was ploughing the summer fallow, immediately shut the engine down. Vance looked over, a flicker of grim satisfaction in his eyes. Looks like you got your own problems. Yep, Jed said, climbing back on his 40-20. Looks like it. He drove back to the farm, where Tom was already looking at the ruptured hose. It was a main pressure line, thick as a man's thumb, that ran from the pump to the steering cylinders. Blew right at the crimp fitting, Dad, Tom said, pointing at the frayed steel braiding. Jed grunted. He went into the shop, came back with 2 large crescent wrenches, and within 5 minutes had the busted hose off. He handed it to Tom. Take the pickup. Go to the Napa store in town. Tell old man Hemmings I need a new one made, 2 feet long, 3/4 inch, rated for 3,000 psi. He'll know what to do. An hour later, Tom was back with a new, black, glistening hydraulic hose. It took Jed another 15 minutes to thread it into place and tighten the fittings. He topped off the hydraulic reservoir, climbed up on the big tractor, and fired the Caterpillar V8 back to life. He worked the steering wheel back and forth, bleeding the air from the system. Then he dropped the plow back in the ground and throttled up. The grey beast leaned into its work, the engine barking, turning the black soil as if nothing had happened. The total cost of the repair was $43.50. The total downtime was less than 2 hours. Across the section, the John Deere service truck was pulling away, leaving the silent 4840 alone in the dying field. The drought finally broke in early August, but it did not break gently. The sky turned a sickening shade of green-black one afternoon. The air grew still and heavy. Jed, watching from his porch, knew what was coming. He and Tom rushed to get the last of the hay wagons into the barn, just as the first massive raindrops began to splat against the dusty ground. Then came the wind. It wasn't a steady blow, it was a physical punch, a solid wall of air that bent ancient oak trees to the ground. Then the hail started, first the size of peas, then marbles, then golf balls. It hammered against the tin roof of the barn with a deafening roar, a sound like 1,000 hammers beating out a rhythm of destruction. The storm lasted only 20 minutes, but it cut a swath a mile wide right through the center of the county. The next morning, the sun rose on a scene of devastation. Jed's farm, on the northern edge of the storm's path, was largely spared. He lost some shingles and had a few acres of beans that were shredded, but the corn still stood. Vance had not been so lucky. Jed drove the county road and stopped his truck, his heart sinking at the sight. Vance's fields looked like they'd been hit by an artillery barrage. The corn stalks were stripped bare, broken and bent over, the ground white with hailstones and shredded leaves. It was a total loss. Hundreds upon hundreds of acres wiped out in minutes. The final blow came not from the sky, but from the radio. President Carter, in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, had announced a grain embargo. The market, which had been the foundation of the entire farm boom, collapsed overnight. Corn prices plunged from over $3 a bushel to barely $2. The whispers in the coffee shop turned from admiration of Rick Vance's ambition to worried speculation. His input costs were locked in. His yields were gone. His prices were in the tank. And his banknotes, with their new, terrifyingly high interest rates, were coming due. The golden age was over. The reckoning had begun. The winter of 1981 was bleak and cold. The snow came early and stayed late, a thick white blanket over a wounded landscape. For most farmers, it was a time of repair and planning. But for Richard Vance, it was a season of slow-motion collapse. The phone calls from Mr. Abernathy at the Merchants Bank became more frequent, his tone shifting from friendly advice to strained insistence. Vance's operating loan, which had rolled over easily for years, was now a monster. The prime interest rate, driven by Paul Volcker's war on inflation, had soared to an unbelievable 21%. A loan that had cost Vance 8 cents on the dollar to service now cost 21. His payments had more than doubled. At the exact moment his income had vanished. He tried to sell some of his newer equipment to raise cash, but no one was buying. The farm crisis was no longer a whisper. It was a roar. Every farmer in the county was cutting back, trying to survive. A 2-year-old combine, bought for $100,000, was now lucky to bring 50. Jed, meanwhile, lived as he always had. His costs were minimal. Fuel, seed, and fertilizer, all paid for with cash from the previous year's crop. He had no payments to make, no interest clocking up against him day and night. One morning, he went to the bank to see Abernathy about setting up a college fund for Tom. The banker looked haggard, his face etched with worry. "Jed," he said after they'd finished the paperwork. He leaned forward, his voice low. "You were right. We all thought you were crazy, sitting on all that cash, running that old junk. We thought Rick Vance was the genius." He shook his head, looking out the window at the quiet town square. "I've got a dozen farmers like him on my books. Good men, hard workers. But they're leveraged to the hilt. This interest rate, it's like a cancer. It's eating them alive. I'm going to have to call his notes. The bank examiners are forcing my hand. I'm going to have to foreclose." Jed felt no triumph, only a deep, profound sadness. "He's got a wife and 2 little girls, Mr. Abernathy." "I know," the banker said, his voice thick with regret. "God help me, I know." The auction was held on a grey, windswept day in late March, almost 10 years to the day since the Miller sale where Jed had bought the Steiger. The irony was lost on no one. This time, the crowd was different. It wasn't full of eager buyers with checkbooks open. It was a somber gathering of neighbors, their faces grim, watching the dismemberment of a dream. They were there to bear witness and perhaps to wonder who would be next. The equipment was lined up in perfect gleaming rows. The John Deere 4840, its transmission finally repaired. The massive Gleaner N7 combine, the fleet of red International tractors. They looked out of place, too new, too shiny for a foreclosure sale. They represented a decade of ambition and easy credit, now being sold for dimes on the dollar. Jed was there, but he stood at the back, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't there to gloat. He was there because he needed a planter. His old 6-row was worn out, and he knew Vance had a nearly new 12-row John Deere Max Emerge, one of the best planters ever made. Richard Vance stood by the porch of the sprawling ranch house he was about to lose, a ghost of the man he once was. The swagger was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed stare. His wife was inside with the curtains drawn. He watched as the auctioneer, the same Henderson from a decade ago, sold off his life's work piece by piece. The prices were disastrous. Tractors sold for half their value. The combine, his pride and joy, went for a third of what he owed on it. When they got to the planter, Jed stepped forward. The bidding was sluggish. A few lowball offers were thrown out. Jed waited, then made his bid, a solid, fair price. Not a steal, but a reasonable number. Henderson looked around. "Do I hear another? Going once? Twice?" He pointed at Jed. "Sold, to Jedstone." As Jed went to settle up, he saw Vance walking towards the barn, away from the crowd. On an impulse, Jed followed him. He found Vance leaning against the big sliding door, his shoulders slumped. "Rick," Jed said softly. Vance didn't turn around. "Come to enjoy the show, Jed? Come to tell me I told you so?" "No," Jed said. "I came to buy a planter, and to say I'm sorry for your trouble." Vance finally turned, his eyes red-rimmed. "You were right," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "All this time I thought you were a fool, living like a pauper, running that old pile of scrap metal." He gestured vaguely toward Jed's farm, a half-mile down the road. "You weren't scared, were you? You were smart. My dad, he farmed like you. Never owed a dime. I thought he was a failure because he never got any bigger. I was the failure, Jed. I built a house of cards on borrowed money, and the first big wind came and blew it all away." Jed just nodded. There was nothing to say. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his checkbook. He wrote out the check for the planter, but he made it out for $500 more than his winning bid. He handed it to Vance. Vance looked at it, confused. "This is too much." "The planter's got extra seed plates with it, right?" Jed said, though he knew it didn't. "And you kept it shedded. That's worth a little extra. For you, not for the bank." Tears welled in Vance's eyes. He folded the check and put it in his pocket, unable to speak. He just nodded, a gesture of profound, broken gratitude. Jed clapped him once on the shoulder, then turned and walked away, the sound of the auctioneer's drone fading behind him. A month later, a for sale sign went up on the 160 acres that bordered Jed's farm to the east, the first piece of land Vance had bought in the boom years. It wasn't for sale by owner, it was for sale by the merchant's bank. The asking price was less than half of what Vance had paid for it. Jed went to see Mr. Abernathy. He didn't haggle, he didn't try to get a deal. He simply wrote a check for the full asking price, drawing down the savings account he had so patiently built for a decade. Just like that, his farm grew to 400 acres. All of it, every square foot, was paid for. The 1980s were a brutal decade for Black Hawk County. More for sale signs went up, more good families moved away. Their land absorbed by the banks or by the few survivors like Jedediah Stone. The coffee shop at the co-op became a quieter, more somber place. The talk was no longer of expansion and new iron, but of survival and making do. The men who were left were the ones who understood the old ways. Their hair was grayer, their faces more lined, but their farms were their own. And when they spoke of Jed Stone, it was with a quiet, hard-earned respect. He wasn't the fool who was afraid of debt. He was the wise man who had seen the trap. Years turned into a decade, then two. The farm economy slowly healed. Land prices began to creep back up, but the speculative fever was gone, replaced by a cautious pragmatism. Jed's son, Tom, went off to agricultural college and came back with a degree and a passion for the land. He brought new ideas about soil conservation and crop genetics, but he had his father's cautious soul. One crisp October afternoon, well into the 1990s, Jed and a 17-year-old Tom were in the shop, giving the old grey Steiger its end-of-season service. The tractor was now over 25 years old, its grey paint faded and scarred from thousands of hours of hard work. But the Caterpillar V8 fired up on the first turn, same as always, its thunderous roar a familiar comfort. They were changing the massive hub oil in the planetary axles, a messy, smelly job. Tom, his arms coated in black gear oil, looked at the old tractor. A brand new gleaming Case IH Magnum tractor, bright red and full of computers, had just been delivered to their neighbor. "Dad," Tom said, wiping his hands on a rag, "that new Magnum next door. It's got GPS, a 24-speed power shift, and 300 horsepower. This old thing," he patted the Steiger's massive frame, "it's just old. Don't you ever think about trading it in? Getting something new?" Jed stopped turning his wrench and looked at his son. He saw the same ambition in his eyes that he'd once seen in Rick Vance's, but it was tempered with a healthy dose of his own caution. He smiled. "Let me tell you about this tractor, son," he said, his voice quiet. He told him the whole story. The auction, the $300 bid, the laughter from the crowd, the long nights of rebuilding the engine, piece by greasy piece. He told him about Richard Vance, about the easy credit and the soaring land prices, and about the terrible crash that followed. "This machine," Jed said, laying a hand on the cold steel frame, "is more than just a tractor. It's a lesson. When I bought it, everyone saw a pile of junk. I saw a way to be free. Every bolt on this machine, from the engine block to the lug nuts, is paid for. It doesn't owe a man on this earth a single dime. When the hard times came, and they always come, Tom, always, that's what saved us." He looked his son square in the eye. "That new tractor next door is beautiful, it's powerful, and it comes with a payment book that's 2 inches thick. The man who owns it doesn't really own it. The bank owns it. He just gets to use it as long as he makes the payments. This," Jed slapped the Steiger's fender, making a dull clang echo through the shop, "we own. There's a difference between being rich and being wealthy. Rich is a big number on a piece of paper from the bank. Wealthy is sleeping soundly at night because you know that whatever happens tomorrow, the ground under your feet and the roof over your head are yours." Tom was silent for a long time, the weight of his father's words sinking in. He looked at the old tractor with new eyes. He no longer saw a relic. He saw a fortress. He saw the story of his family, welded together in steel and painted industrial grey. He saw a legacy of independence. "Let's finish this up," Tom said, picking up his wrench. "She's got a lot of work to do next spring." Jed grinned, a deep sense of peace settling over him. He watched his son, a young man on the cusp of his own life, learning the most important lesson the land could teach. Later that evening, as the sun set, Tom took the old Steiger out for one last pass on a field of corn stubble just to hear the engine run. Jed stood on the back porch, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching the tractor's single headlight cut a path through the twilight. The deep, rhythmic thunder of the Caterpillar V8 rolled across the fields, a sound that for decades had been a punchline for his neighbors. But to Jed, it was the sound of victory. It was the sound of survival. It was the sound of a promise kept, a lesson learned, and a future secured, all thanks to a paid-off Junkyard four-wheel drive.